They said the HOA was here to protect property values. But for me, it became a nightmare I couldn't escape. One letter turned into three. Then came the threats, the fines, the endless demands, all over things so petty, so absurd, you wouldn't believe them if I told you. And just when I thought it couldn't get worse, they crossed a line no one should ever cross. That's when I realized if they wanted a fight, they were about to get one. Because this time, I wasn't backing down. So how far would you go when the people running your neighborhood pushed too far?
Life in Willow Creek was quiet, almost picture perfect. Tree-lined streets, kids riding bikes, neighbors waving from white picket fences. I had just finished building my dream home, a place with wide windows that let in the morning sun and a backyard that stretched farther than I could ever imagine. On weekends, I'd sip coffee on the porch while watching deer wander through the fields, thinking I had finally found the peace I'd worked so hard for.
Our little community had its quirks, sure. The HOA claimed to protect property values, and most neighbors followed the rules without question. It all seemed harmless at first, a reminder to keep lawns tidy, houses freshly painted, and trash cans out of sight. But beneath the calm, there was a subtle rigidity that no one really talked about. A casual conversation could turn into a warning. A minor oversight could become a complaint. I never imagined I'd become the target. At first it was small things, a letter about my fence being slightly taller than regulations, a note about a flower bed that didn't match community standards. I laughed it off, thinking it was just part of living in a managed neighborhood. But there was something in the tone of those letters, the cold, precise language, the hint of authority that made me uneasy.
Then came the first real warning about my property. Something about boundaries. Something about unapproved structures that I hadn't even noticed. The HOA was sending inspectors, and suddenly my peaceful life felt invaded. Every visit, every knock at the door carried a tension that I hadn't expected. I realized that my dream home, the place I'd built with care and pride, was now a stage for something much darker. Rules enforced not for safety or aesthetics, but for control. At first, the warnings felt petty. A flower bed that didn't meet community standards, a mailbox that was too tall, even complaints about the color of my porch lights. But then the letters began piling up, their tone colder and more authoritative each time. I tried to ignore them, thinking it was just bureaucracy overstepping, but the pattern was clear. The HOA wasn't satisfied until they had complete control over every inch of my property.
One morning, I found a notice stapled to my front door. It was official looking, stamped with the HOA's emblem, warning me of a fine, hundreds of dollars, for a shed I had built 3 months ago, which, according to them, had violated community regulations. I had filed all the proper permits with the county. I double-checked the rules. Nothing indicated a problem. Still, the letter claimed I had ignored repeated notifications that had never arrived. Frustration turned to disbelief, then to anger. I called the HOA office, trying to reason with them. The receptionist's polite tone quickly turned firm, and then, when I asked to speak to a manager, dismissive. Rules are rules, they said. You'll need to comply or face escalating fines. Their insistence that I was at fault, despite all evidence to the contrary, felt like being trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake from.
Things escalated further when a neighbor, someone I barely knew, started following the HOA's lead. I noticed them standing near my driveway, taking photos of my property as if preparing evidence for a court case I hadn't been summoned to yet. A note appeared in my mailbox. Your garden is out of compliance. Immediate correction required. It wasn't signed by anyone in particular, but the implication was clear. The HOA had eyes everywhere, and now so did the neighbors. I tried documenting everything, photos, emails, letters, hoping to prove my compliance. But every attempt to defend myself seemed only to provoke them further. A few weeks later, I woke up to find my mailbox removed. The HOA called it an unauthorized modification, even though the city had installed it. And then came the fines, small at first, then ballooning into amounts that could cripple someone financially if they didn't comply immediately.
Meanwhile, community meetings became another battlefield. I attended one, hoping to plead my case publicly, to show that the rules were being applied unfairly. But the board was unyielding, their words dripping with condescension. "We enforce the rules equally," they said, though it was obvious that several neighbors had structures and gardens far more non-compliant than mine, and no one had been fined. The humiliation stung, and the sense of injustice festered. It wasn't just the fines or the letters anymore. It was the constant surveillance, the fear that anything I did, even fixing a broken fence or trimming a tree, could become the next violation. I felt trapped in a war I hadn't started, but one I couldn't ignore. Sleep became restless. Every knock at the door made my heart race. Every car that slowed in front of my house made me glance toward the window, wondering if they were taking notes for the next complaint. Then came the first legal notice. Not just fines this time, but an actual threat of court action. The HOA claimed that my property interfered with planned developments and that their previous notices were legally binding warnings. I hired a lawyer thinking this would finally put an end to it, but the HOA seemed prepared, armed with detailed documentation, photographs, and a relentless will to assert control. The correspondence with my attorney became another source of anxiety, each letter more complex and intimidating than the last. Amidst all this, my relationships in the neighborhood began to strain. Friends who once stopped by for coffee now hesitated. Conversations turned awkward, as if anyone seen as supporting me could be targeted next. I realized this wasn't just a dispute over a shed or a flower bed. It was a power play, a battle of wills designed to break me down emotionally and socially.
And then the unthinkable happened. One evening, I returned home to find a violation notice stapled to my door, this time accusing me of building structures that obstructed drainage, a claim that could have serious legal consequences. I knew there was no truth to it, yet the letter was intimidating, detailed, and impossible to ignore. My frustration boiled into a dangerous determination. I couldn't just comply blindly anymore. Something had to give, and soon. Weeks of harassment, fines, and intimidation had pushed me to the edge. Every interaction with the HOA had become a chess match, each letter and notice another calculated move to provoke fear and compliance. I had spent countless hours documenting violations, speaking with attorneys, and researching legal loopholes. But the frustration of watching bureaucracy and power wielded so recklessly left me seething. And yet, I had never felt closer to a breakthrough, or closer to losing everything I had built. It began with a routine letter from the HOA that should have been simple. Instead, it was a bombshell. They claimed I had violated multiple community standards simultaneously. And this time, the fines weren't just financial. They threatened legal action to seize portions of my property. My heart sank. I reread the document, disbelief giving way to fury. The claims were absurd. A fence that perfectly matched code, a garden that adhered to previous approvals, and trees that predated the HOA itself. Yet they had worded it to sound undeniable. I knew I couldn't just pay or plead ignorance this time. This was no longer about compliance. It was about asserting my rights and proving that their power had limits. I gathered every piece of evidence I had accumulated: photographs, letters, emails, permits, even recorded conversations. every shred of proof that showed their claims were baseless became ammunition for the confrontation I knew had to come.
The confrontation itself was scheduled at the community hall, a room I had once walked into casually, shaking hands with neighbors and board members. Now, it felt like an arena. The air was thick with anticipation. Board members sat at the front, faces impassive, while a small crowd of residents lingered on the edges, curious about the unfolding drama. I stepped forward, a folder heavy in my hands, a mix of anxiety and determination tightening my chest. I began by calmly presenting the facts, item by item, countering each violation with documentation. The first claim, my so-called illegal shed, was demolished with building permits and dated photographs. The board members exchanged glances, but said nothing. The second accusation, the fence, was refuted with HOA-approved plans and testimony from other residents who had installed similar structures. The room's tension ratcheted higher as I methodically tore apart each baseless claim, piece by piece, evidence against assertion, truth against intimidation.
And then it escalated. One of the board members, a man known for his cold, controlling demeanor, tried to interrupt, insisting that their enforcement was absolute and that rules were rules, regardless of documentation. That was the moment I realized words alone weren't enough. I had to make them see the absurdity of their own authority, the injustice they had inflicted, not just on me, but on the community itself. I revealed something that left the room gasping. Internal emails from the HOA's management company showing deliberate targeting of my property while ignoring clear violations elsewhere. The hypocrisy was undeniable. Faces turned pale, murmurs ran through the audience, and even some board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I had caught them red-handed, their veneer of fairness stripped away by their own words.
The climax came with a final, decisive move. I had consulted my attorney in advance and obtained a temporary injunction, a legal shield that prevented the HOA from issuing further fines or taking punitive action while the dispute was resolved in court. Presenting this document, I watched the tension explode. The man who had spoken so arrogantly earlier went pale, fumbling for words. Other board members whispered nervously, and the crowd's curiosity turned to satisfaction. In that moment, the balance of power shifted. It wasn't just about the fines or the letters anymore. It was about exposing the abuse of authority, standing firm against manipulation, and asserting a sense of justice long denied. The room felt charged with energy, a mix of relief, awe, and indignation. Residents who had quietly watched now nodded in acknowledgement. Some whispered congratulations, as though recognizing that a turning point had been reached, not just for me, but for the integrity of the community itself.
Yet even as the board members tried to salvage face, their authority shaken, I knew the battle wasn't completely over. Lawsuits, appeals, and lingering tension remained ahead. But in that intense, charged moment, I had delivered the most decisive blow possible. I had stood up, armed with evidence, courage, and determination, and shown that even entrenched power could be challenged. After the climactic showdown, life didn't immediately return to normal, and I wouldn't have expected it to. The HOA's grip had been weakened, but the tension that had been simmering for months lingered like a shadow over every interaction in the neighborhood. I spent the next days reviewing documents, meeting with my attorney, and double-checking that every detail of my property and legal standing was secure. The uncertainty that had plagued me for so long didn't vanish overnight, but there was a newfound sense of control that I hadn't felt in months. A sense that for the first time I was no longer at the mercy of arbitrary rules or vindictive neighbors.
News of the confrontation spread through the neighborhood quickly. Some residents who had been silent observers reached out,
expressing relief that someone had finally stood up to the HOA's overreach. Others, particularly those who had relied on the HOA to maintain a rigid status quo, were less forgiving. The social dynamics had shifted, and the ripple effects of that single meeting would continue to shape the community for months and perhaps years to come. Legally, the temporary injunction became a turning point. The HOA could no longer levy fines arbitrarily or claim violations without solid documentation. They were forced to acknowledge my evidence, and in doing so, they inadvertently exposed weaknesses in their enforcement system. My attorney and I reviewed every previous fine and notice, and several were officially rescinded. Some had accumulated into substantial amounts, and the HOA quietly adjusted their records, erasing penalties that had been imposed without proper justification. It was a small but deeply satisfying victory, a tangible reminder that fairness could prevail when evidence and persistence met courage.
The HOA itself faced scrutiny. The board members, once untouchable, now had their credibility questioned, not only by residents, but also by oversight agencies that monitor community associations. Meetings that had been perfunctory and one-sided transformed into forums where rules were openly debated, where questions were encouraged, and where transparency became not just an ideal, but a necessity. The culture of fear and intimidation that had allowed petty enforcement to flourish began to erode, replaced with cautious accountability. I had hoped for this outcome, but seeing it unfold in real time was more satisfying than I could have imagined. On a personal level, the experience left a lasting impact. I had learned firsthand the emotional toll of being caught in a power struggle, the frustration of navigating arbitrary rules, and the isolation that comes when neighbors and authorities alike turn a blind eye. Yet, it also revealed resilience I didn't know I possessed. I had found the courage to document everything meticulously, to speak publicly, and to assert my rights without hesitation. That courage carried over into other areas of my life, a reminder that standing firm against injustice is rarely easy, but almost always transformative.
My home, once a source of stress and conflict, gradually returned to its former status as a sanctuary. I spent weekends repairing minor damages caused by the months of scrutiny, trimming gardens, repainting fences, and restoring the peace that had been disrupted. Every improvement felt symbolic, a reclamation of the space that was rightfully mine, and the quiet statement to anyone who might have doubted my resolve. My family, too, felt the change. The tension that had hung over our daily lives lifted, replaced with laughter, calm evenings on the porch, and a renewed sense of security. Interestingly, the HOA dispute prompted conversations throughout the neighborhood that had never occurred before. Residents who had once feared speaking up began to question rules that seemed arbitrary or excessive. Some joined committees to advocate for transparency. Others proposed amendments to bylaws that prioritized fairness over control. My confrontation had inadvertently sparked a wave of community engagement, a reminder that standing up for oneself can inspire others to do the same.
Financially, the resolution provided relief as well. The rescinded fines and halted legal threats prevented significant monetary loss, and my attorney's careful handling of the injunction ensured that the HOA could not retaliate without facing legal consequences. While there were still minor disputes to resolve, the looming threat that had dominated my life was removed, leaving room for planning, restoration, and forward momentum. The sense of stability was invaluable, a reward for persistence and strategic action. Emotionally, the outcome was profound. For months, I had wrestled with feelings of helplessness, anger, and even fear. But facing the HOA head-on, armed with facts, legal counsel, and an unwavering sense of purpose, transformed those emotions into empowerment. I realized that the true battle was never just about fines or garden fences. It was about defending autonomy, integrity, and the principle that no one should live under constant intimidation in their own home. That realization reshaped my perspective on conflict, resilience, and the kind of person I wanted to be.
The HOA, naturally, attempted to recover from the embarrassment. They introduced new policies aimed at preventing future challenges, but these were tempered by oversight and transparency measures that limited arbitrary enforcement. In other words, the system adapted, not by reclaiming control over residents, but by acknowledging the need for fairness. The very structure that had been their instrument of power was forced to evolve, proving that accountability is the most potent check against abuse. Looking back, the entire ordeal was exhausting, stressful, and emotionally draining. Yet, in hindsight, it was also a lesson in perseverance, courage, and the power of standing firm against unjust authority. My home, my family, and even my sense of self emerged stronger. I had faced a seemingly insurmountable obstacle, and not only survived, but reshaped the environment that had sought to dominate me. That transformation, from frustration and fear to confidence and empowerment, was the true resolution of the story. Ultimately, the HOA dispute became more than a personal conflict. It became a statement about justice, fairness, and community accountability. It reminded everyone involved, neighbors, board members, and myself, that rules are meant to serve people, not control them. It highlighted the consequences of unchecked power and the importance of evidence, preparation, and courage in the face of intimidation. And most importantly, it proved that one determined individual could spark change, challenge authority, and reclaim not just property, but dignity. As I look out over my yard now, the sunlight casting long shadows across the lawn, I can't help but reflect on what this entire experience taught me. It wasn't just a battle over fences, gardens, or sheds. It was a confrontation with fear, bureaucracy, and the human tendency to exploit power. And I emerged not only victorious, but wiser, more resilient, and acutely aware of the value of standing up for oneself. So if you ever find yourself facing an overbearing HOA or a community that seems more interested in control than fairness, remember this: documentation, persistence, courage, and strategic action are your allies. Justice isn't guaranteed, but it's achievable when you refuse to be intimidated, when you speak truth to power, and when you recognize that your home and your peace of mind are worth defending. In the end, my neighborhood is quieter, my property secure, and my sense of autonomy restored. But the lessons linger. Change is possible, even in the most rigid systems, and sometimes it only takes one determined person to prove that standing up for what's right isn't just a choice, it's a responsibility.